And also I will be sharing this on the Facebook. Okay, so Junaid, please feel free to hand over the session to you. So feel free to begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hassanal. Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Junaid Ahmed and I teach law, religion and world politics in Pakistan. Welcome to all of our participants in every corner of the globe. I welcome all of you on behalf of our organization, the Movement for Liberation from Nakba, or MLN for short. Allow me first to give both a brief introduction to MLN as well as to the topic at hand today. Movement for Liberation from Nakba is a coalition of organizations and individuals based throughout the world, and in particular in Asia and the global South more broadly. We're involved in a variety of global justice initiatives, but we all come together in MLN to demonstrate our absolute and unequivocal solidarity with the Palestinians. MLN aims to educate and create awareness about historical Palestine, the 1948 Nakba, the Palestinian minority inside Israel, of course, the occupied West Bank and the besieged Gaza Strip, and the plight of millions of Palestinian refugees. Our goal is to serve as a platform of informed analysis of the Palestinian struggle against Israeli colonization. We try to situate the discussion of Palestine squarely within the matrix of anti-colonialism and anti-racism, and the framework of human rights and international humanitarian law. For us, to be anti-Zionist is to be anti-colonial and to be anti-racist. With this premise, we center a narrative that affirms the Palestinian struggle for liberation from ongoing Israeli settler colonialism, from the Zionist-inflicted ongoing Nakba. Please do visit our website and our Facebook page. Our friends will post that if it's not already been posted. I think it has, in our chat box, to find out more about us, to join in our global movement. The topic for today's webinar is incredibly pertinent for the day that we're holding it on, December 11th. The topic, UN Resolution 194 and the practicalities of the right of return. So just a few words about the resolution before we have our speakers begin. UN Resolution 194 was passed on December 11th, 1948, hence the choice for today for this event. The resolution adopted stipulated that the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live in peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date, and that compensation should be paid for the property of those choosing not to return, or for loss or damage to property which, under principles of international law or in equity by the governments or authorities responsible. It calls on the Conciliation Commission to facilitate the repatriation, resettlement, and economic and social rehabilitation of the refugees and the payment of compensation. Our speakers today are deeply engaged in studying and acting on the questions surrounding this issue. We will have our first speaker begin the discussion, and then we will have two discussants to respond, and then we will have discussion as the format indicates as a roundtable in which our participants hopefully also have their questions and comments. So let me introduce our speakers really quickly and then get right into it. Our speaker who will lead the discussion today is Lubna Shumali. She is a Palestinian human rights defender and activist. She's with Badal Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights. Badal is a Palestinian human rights organization established in 1998, dedicated to defending and promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons. Badal is one of the leading and most respected resources on historic and contemporary forcible transfer and the Palestinian refugee and IDP issue. Our discussants will include, first, Professor Ilan Pape, one of the leading historians of Palestine in the world, author of many works, including the very important Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Professor Pape is with the College of Social Sciences and International Studies at the University of Exeter, where he's a director of the European Center for Palestine Studies. Professor Pape's role in combating Zionism through meticulous scholarship has been second to none. His invaluable contribution towards the liberation of Palestine can in no way be understated. And our final discussant is Naeem Jinnah. He's the executive director of the Afro-Middle East Center, a research institute dedicated to studying the Middle East and North Africa, based in Johannesburg, South Africa. He's been a lifelong activist and public intellectual, a young militant activist against apartheid, a prominent voice for justice and leader amongst Muslims in groups such as the Muslim Youth Movement, and generally speaking, a tireless and formidable Palestine solidarity activist, not only in South Africa, but globally. So as we can all see, we have a very distinguished group of speakers to lead this very important discussion on this very important day. So at this point, I will ask Lubna to begin our discussion, and then we can get responses from both Professor Pape and Naeem. So Lubna, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Junaid, and thanks everyone for putting this together so quickly and agreeing to having this roundtable on this very important day in Palestinian history at the anniversary of UN Resolution 194. The thing I want to say about UN Resolution 194 is that it is just a reaffirmation of very entrenched international law principles and practices. It reaffirms the right of return for Palestinian refugees and IDPs and their entitlement to compensation and guarantees of non-repetition. We're going to be talking about all those concepts, but I'd like to preface that with saying that in Palestine, one of the fundamental truths or the realities that we are exposed to is that the Nakba is ongoing. In other words, the Nakba is not isolated explicitly to the historic events of 1948, but it is an ongoing phenomenon. The international community continues to both witness and ignore the ongoing displacement and dispossession of the Palestinian people that was initiated during that time. The end result, of course, of this to the witnessing and the ignoring is the creation, sustainment, and augmentation of the largest and longest standing displaced population in the world. Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons number 9 million today. And that's 67% of the Palestinian people, 67. Let's think about that number for a minute. Excuse me. That means that out of every 10 Palestinians you know, 7 of them will have experienced displacement at least once in their lifetime, with significant numbers having experienced it more than once. How is this reality achieved? It's achieved by a vicious cycle of ongoing displacement and the simultaneous prevention of return. This cycle is a consequence of a plethora of Israeli laws, policies, practices that basically culminate in a colonial and apartheid regime that perpetuates population transfers in order to alter the demographic composition of mandatory Palestine and annexation of its historic lands. Population transfers are prohibited according to international law and international human rights law, particularly if they are perpetrated to unlawfully annex territory and or alter the demographic composition of that territory. Population transfers encapsulate both the implantation of a foreign population in a territory and the forced displacement of the indigenous or habitual residents out of that territory. Once displaced, obligations fall upon the perpetrator and the international community to right this internationally wrongful act through the exercise of the right of return. The right of return is fundamental in the Palestinian context as it is both an individual and collective right, intrinsically connected to the right of self-determination. It must be noted that any attempt in securing self-determination without addressing the right of return for the millions of displaced Palestinians is unachievable. In other words, how can Palestinian self-determination be achieved if the majority of the people are not allowed to exercise their right of return? As such, the right of return of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons, or IDPs, is an elemental facet of the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people. When we talk about reparations in both principle and in practice, well, in principle, according to international law, the notion of the right of return is founded upon the free will of the displaced individuals and groups. It's based on the rights of residency, adequate housing, safety, freedom of movement, etc. It's very intrinsic to other basic rights enshrined in international law. The right of return is one of 3 durable solutions offered to displaced groups and persons under international law. Those 3 durable solutions would be return or voluntary repatriation, integration into the current host country, or resettlement in another country. Now, only one of those durable solutions is an actual right, and that's the right of return. The other 2, resettlement and integration, are based on the goodwill of states and are not enshrined as rights within international law. Of the 3 solutions, because the right of return is a right, and because it is seen as the most viable option to address issues of displacement, apartheid, colonialism, racism, et cetera, it is most favored and it constitutes the best practice of states. The other 2 solutions, of course, require the consent of the hosting states. In other words, the hosting states or the states in which resettlement were to occur, they would have to agree to integrate or resettle refugees and IDPs. Hence, if a refugee is IDP is given only one option from the durable solutions, such as resettlement or integration, it's not an adequate exercise of their right of return because the free will of the individual is forsaken. And this is the essence of the right of return. It's based on the free will of the individual. For Palestinians, the right of return is both an individual and collective right and cannot be forfeited by the will of states or individuals. In other words, Israel's denial of the right of return, or perhaps the Palestinian Authority's capitulation to compromise the right of return, is not acceptable under international law. The right of return is independent of refugee status, nationality, or the causes of displacement, and was created for the purpose of preventing and addressing situations of statelessness and population transfers. The refugee or IDP condition is created by the commission of human rights violations and international crimes by states or other actors under its jurisdiction, and or the failure of states to ensure national protection for people under its jurisdiction. Ensuring protection in persons in need of it becomes an international responsibility when the state in question is unwilling or unable to ensure it. In this case, of course, Israel is unwilling to ensure the right of return of Palestinian refugees or IDPs. International protection through international intervention is thus therefore triggered by Israel's unwillingness to provide and ensure protection for the Palestinian people under its jurisdiction. First and foremost, of course, is to prevent the creation of forcibly displaced persons, whether they are refugees or internally displaced. And if a group or a person or group is forcibly displaced, ensuring that the right of return is is available or implemented in order to right that wrong that was committed. With regards to reparations mechanisms, establishing and or maintaining security and stability are important concerns in how, but not whether, to implement the right to reparations. Justice and access to legal redress are important components of both stability and security. The right to reparations was designed to achieve exactly that, restoring as much as possible what once was and eliminating apartheid and colonial practices and or legislation that caused the internationally wrongful acts in the first place. It goes without saying, of course, that refugee and IDP repatriation must be gradual and orderly. It must be carried out according to tested and established mechanisms, taking into consideration the equitable redistribution of property and ensuring that social and economic integration of returnees. The national legislation needs to adequately reflect and address reparation-related issues and not be discriminatory in nature or practice. As such, the question of the nature of the state which will receive Palestinian refugees and IDPs is of the utmost importance. A state which is democratic, participatory, inclusive, can embrace all peoples and ensure rights for all regardless of their religious affiliation. However, the current Israeli regime employs discriminatory national legislation and practices that constitute both colonialism and apartheid. It is necessary to dismantle the apartheid colonial regime and replace it with a democratic and inclusive one that respects the rights of all people. Hence, the nature of the state that is required is one that ensures equality and equity for all, regardless of religious affiliation, ethnicity, race, or demographic composition. The right to reparations of forcibly displaced persons, according to the frameworks of international law and other treaties on reparations, consists of four main elements: voluntary physical repatriation, property restitution, compensation, and guarantees of non-repetition, or in other words, victim satisfaction. Voluntary repatriation is the physical return of the victim or victims to their places of origin or habitual residence. Note that reparation must be voluntary because this is based on the free will of the individual. This includes the right not to be displaced against your will, the right to freely choose return, and the right not to be forced to return. The second element of reparations is property restitution, which is the reclamation of the original properties lost by the victims. The third element is compensation for property damage for benefits lost by the victims from loss and denial of use of his or her property, and for non-material damages such as pain and suffering of victims or loss of dignity. And the last element, as I said, is victim satisfaction, and that includes, among other things, guarantees of non-repetition. The elements of reparations were established to ensure the restoration as much as possible to what once was for victims of forced displacement and transfer. As such, the elements are indivisible, and reparations packages must include all the elements for it to be successful and effective so that the consequences of forced displacement and transfer are reversed. Successful reparations mechanisms employ an aggressive property restitution mechanism rather than monetary compensation in order to address ethnic cleansing, racially based spatial segregation, apartheid, and or colonial domination, which are the precursors to the refugee or IDP condition. In addition, property restitution requires less financial inputs than a pure compensation approach. Property restitution as a component of reparations remedies dispossession through the reclamation of the original property lost by the original property owner. After 1948, Israel created and implemented the absentee property law, which stripped Palestinian refugees and IDPs of their property. Accordingly, Palestinian victims of state-sponsored discriminatory land discriminatory land regime have the right to property restitution from the state. This means that Israel is responsible for the return of all properties to Palestinian victims seeking property restitution, and for the compensation for those who don't seek property restitution. One of the arguments, of course, proposed by Israel is that there's not enough land to accommodate large numbers of returnees and subsequent property restitution. This is not accurate. As a matter of fact, there are significant tracts of lands on which Palestinian villages existed that are still not populated, and the land is available for reclamation. The vast majority of Israeli colonies constructed after 1948 were constructed adjacent to the actual properties. Of course, not all of them, but most of them. According to the Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, 92% of Israelis live in urban areas. It also should be noted that significant amounts of land are in the public domain. In other words, 93% of the land in Israel, approximately 4.8 million acres, or about 19.5 million dunams, is either the property of the state, the Jewish National Fund, or the Development Authority. This land is managed by the Israeli Land Authority, whose policy is dictated by the Israel Land Council. In situations when the land is not vacant, that there are secondary occupants on the land. In this case, this would be Israeli colonizers. Where the original property, whether it is home or land, is occupied by Israeli colonizers, international law and best practice is very clear. Not all property rights are equal. Secondary occupancy rights would not block refugee or IDP return and or restitution. Israel is responsible to ensure alternative housing for the secondary occupants in cases where refugees and IDPs seek property restitution of those secondary occupied properties. Further, if the property was acquired in good faith by the secondary occupant, then he or she is also entitled to compensation. However, if the property was not acquired in good faith, where the property was directly confiscated by the secondary occupants or through racially discriminatory allocation of property, then it is not reasonable to prioritize the secondary occupants' rights over those of the refugees or IDPs. However, either with or without good faith, the state is under an obligation to ensure property restitution and compensation to victims and to secure their rights the rights of those secondary occupants with alternative housing. Another point to note with regards to property restitution and the numbers of Palestinian refugees and their descendants, because as I mentioned, we are talking about almost a little over 9 million people when we take into consideration both Palestinian refugees and IDPs. A mechanism needs to be developed and put in place to equitably reallocate the original property to a larger group of victims. For example, a Palestinian refugee from XYZ village owned 1,000 dunams of land, but this person's descendants now number 120 refugees. A mechanism to distribute the land between the 120 needs to be developed and implemented. This would naturally require the participation and engagement of refugees and IDPs themselves to determine the modes and mechanisms of the land distribution. In summation, reparations go hand in hand with sustainable post-conflict reconstruction, not just political, physical, or structural, but legal, ideological, social, and economic reform. Reparations were designed to restore a lost right, restore the physical property lost and or its equivalent and or monetary compensation, to promote justice and reconciliation that the process contributes to an economic uplift. However, in order to get to this stage of the process, there have to be certain preconditions that must be achieved. The recognition of Israel's historic and continuing role in the augmentation and sustainment of the Palestinian refugee and IDP condition through an ideology, policies, and practices embedded in forcible transfer, colonialism, and apartheid. The necessary interventions of the international community to bring Israel into compliance with international law through the fulfillment of their responsibilities, including dismantling the colonial and apartheid regime and its elements within the Israeli regime. and determining and establishing a viable implementer of reparations for the Palestinian people, which includes their active and meaningful participation. While the current conditions are not conducive to achieving just and durable solutions to the Palestinian refugee and IDP situation, i.e. the implementation of the right to reparations, including return, we need not wait for these preconditions to be met or a robust peace agreement to be exacted to prepare for Palestinian return. It is paramount that preparations for refugee and IDP reparations begins now in order to be optimally successful. We can start with extensive awareness raising and education campaigns focusing on the principles and best practices of return, kind of like what we're doing today. Engaging Palestinian civil society, particularly refugees and IDPs, in developing reparations models and mechanisms, including for property redistribution and compensation. And of course, discuss, debate, and determine the characteristics of the state, its legislation, and governance mechanisms. The role of human rights bodies and organizations, in addition to the above, is to continue to document both past and present human rights violations and crimes perpetrated by Israel, and advocate for measures to end impunity and ensure accountability. The role of the international community is to respond with appropriate and practical measures to hold Israel accountable and to provide protection to the Palestinian people from further displacement and forcible transfer. And I hope I didn't go over on time.
No, you were perfectly fine, Lubna. In fact, we would have made an exception if you went over anyways, because your presentation was so incredibly comprehensive. I think it gave such an overview of the issues involved. It's hard for me to think how anyone would have any questions about either what the resolution was calling for or the way this can be, must be implemented practically today. So Lubna, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And now we will move on to our first discussant, and that is our distinguished Professor Ilan Pape. Professor Pape, would you begin?
Yes, thank you, Junaid.
Most welcome.
It is, and thank you everyone for organizing this and everyone for attending this. This is an important day to commemorate and ponder upon, and I'm so glad that we managed, as Lubna said, quite in the last moment to get it done. And it's a tough task to follow, Lubna. It was such a comprehensive analysis of both the historical background and, more importantly, probably about the practicalities that do not have to be invented, that are enshrined in the international law, that can make the right of return a practical program rather than a wishful thinking or a utopian vision. And I think that is very important to remember, because even some supporters of Palestine, whom I won't mention, and some of them are quite famous, tell Palestinians, forget about the right of return. It's not realistic. And they make it seem like something which is too idealistic and irrelevant in our world. And I think what Lubna has showed us, that there is a detailed mechanism for implementing such a right, beyond the question of the moral right, the sacred right of refugees who were victims of an ongoing ethnic cleansing to return. So I think that's a very important path to continue, not just to stick to the sound bites and the slogans and the moral stance, which are very important, but to make sure that people understand that this is a practical program and a realistic one. And I'm especially thinking in this, as I said, in this respect, I'm thinking less about the Israelis and their supporters, who anyway reject the right of return from all angles. I'm thinking about actually the people who could be more forcefully involved in supporting this, who probably genuinely believe that this is not something one can envision practically or pragmatically. And I think Lubna has shown us that this is not the case. So this is something to continue to study and important. I would like to add to Lubna's very comprehensive analysis. Really, I'm left with the crumbs. Kind of six points that relate to Resolution 194 that was adopted on the 11th of December 1994. And as Junai had mentioned, it was prepared by the Palestine Conciliation Commission, a committee that involved the United States, France, and Turkey. And they replaced the United Nations mediator, the Swedish Count Bernadotte, who was the main mediator, which was assassinated by Israeli terrorists in September 1948, and he was replaced by this committee. And what is interesting that and this is my first point, that as historians we have to be careful of imposing the reality today on the 48 reality. We have to look exactly the other way around. We have to look at 48 as when people acted there without knowing what's going to happen. And why is this important? Because maybe our viewers and listeners will be surprised that the main force behind the idea of determining the right of return of the Palestinian refugees at that moment in time, that is on the 11th of December 1948, the most important actor on the international scene pushing for unconditional return of the Palestinians was the United States of America. And this is something worth pondering about because we tend to take a very deterministic and teleological view on American policy as a lost case, as a policy that will never change. And why are we doing it? Because soon after 1948, American policy was totally pro-Israeli, and America played the role of dishonest broker throughout the days of the peace process, especially since 1967. But since we all understand that there are changes in the American public opinion, and especially among the younger generation, including within the Jewish younger generation in America, it's important to understand that policies of influential actors can change in time. And the reason the American policy, and I don't want to idealize it, but the reason that the Americans were totally supporting the right of return, in fact, I don't know if our viewers and listeners know, America imposed sanctions on Israel for its refusal to allow the repatriation of the Palestinian refugees. This sounds like taken from a science fiction book, but this really happened in history. They imposed sanctions because of that, the Israeli refusal to allow the return of the refugees. Now, the reason that this was done, it was not that the Americans were particularly moral in their position, was that it looked so natural to the officials in the American State Department who were dealing with the Palestine issue, that refugees in a country where their houses were still there, the villages were still there, regardless of whether they left because of fighting or because they were expelled, the Americans said it doesn't matter to the Israelis, it doesn't matter why these people left. They should be allowed to return. I mean, this has nothing to do with a peace agreement or whatever. And of course, maybe naively or not naively, they misunderstood what around President Truman at the time, everybody understood, that the whole project of Zionism, and that's the second point, which is so important about this resolution, that the whole essence of the Zionist project as a settler colonial project was meant to displace the Palestinians, to expel them. And therefore, any logical, even not very moral, but just commonsensical analysis of the situation of the refugees that some officials in the American State Department conducted, including the Secretary of State at the time, John Foster Dulles, this kind of sensible, commonsensical analysis was totally irrelevant from the Israeli point of view, because ideologically, Israel did, and before that the Zionist movement did all it could to get as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians in it as possible. And therefore, an international reaction that treated the refugees as victims, either of expulsion or of a war, it didn't matter, and who have a basic automatic right to go back to their homes, was against the Zionist ideology. And in many ways, the creation of AIPAC that would appear in 1952 for the first time, the creation of AIPAC, one of the reasons that Israel created AIPAC was the understanding that if you don't have a powerful lobby that intimidates and seduces politicians, you might have, even in America, reasonable people with a modicum of decency in them supporting the right of return, regardless of anything else in the history of Palestine. And AIPAC was successful in that respect, of course, with the help of other lobbies, such as the Christian Zionist lobby. But it's an important point to take into account that if you don't see it through the filter of Zionist ideology, there can be no objection, either in 48 or in 2021, to the return of refugees before you talk about anything else when it comes to Palestine and the issues there. So the second point, which I already mentioned, but just to highlight it, that the Israeli particular position towards the Resolution 194, and ever since the Israeli official position on repatriation and the right of return, the most important aspect of it is it exposes the racist nature of the state of Israel. And we have to understand, and with this I come to my third point, we have to ask ourselves who tolerated the idea, who accepted the idea that a state that is at its core racist, ethnically racist, at the heart of the Arab world, is regarded as a is responsible for this. As I say, the position towards the right of return, if examined from any possible angle, should have exposed very clearly that the Israeli position is based on racism and nothing else. And Lubna already mentioned the internally displaced person. So any other Israeli attempts to explain that there's an issue of demographic balance and so on, of course, collapse when it comes, for instance, to the internal refugees in Israel, because they're already part of the demographic balance. And you don't allow even these people to return to their villages. So it's very clear that these are not the issue. The issue is we expelled these people to make sure that they're not coming back, and we're still involved in expelling people because we have not completed the ethnic cleansing of 1948. And so many of the Israeli policies since 1948 are informed by this desire to empty Palestine of its original native indigenous people. So who allows it? And that's my third point. In many ways, at the time in 48 and 49, it was not so much the United States. This would come afterwards. And I think it's always important historically to understand, not to impose what we know today on the past. It was Europe. It was Europe. And we should not absolve Europe from its, especially Britain, of course, but not only Britain. We should not absolve Europe for not only allowing Zionist colonization to take place, and not only for allowing the ethnic cleansing of 1948 to unfold, but also to give Israel a carte blanche of support to reject the right of return, Resolution 194. And Europe was important in that respect in the United Nations. And the reason, and this is something we have to explain to people again and again, Europe had a problem with its Jewish population that culminated in the genocide of the Jews in the Second World War. It was not only Nazi Germany that was busy exterminating Jews. They had brilliant allies in Holland, in Belgium, in Sweden, in the Ukraine. In fact, there is not one European country where Europeans did not gladly cooperated with the Nazis in the extermination of the Jews. So this was a dark moment in the history of Europe, and Europe wanted to, understandably, to put this dark moment behind it. But instead of dealing with racism, and that's why still there is so much racism in Western Europe and all over Europe today, instead of really dealing with it and asking themselves how they, who sort of broadcasted themselves as the civilization, as the light to all other civilization, have experienced such a dark moment of inhumanity and monstrosity that nobody else in the world has ever experienced before and after. Instead of dealing with it, here comes the Zionist movement and offers a formula. It says, especially it says it to Western Germany. As you remember, Germany was not united then. It was Western Germany and Eastern Germany. So they offer Western Germany a deal. You will be regarded as a new Germany, and through you, Europe will be regarded as a new Europe, because you will be legitimized by the Zionist movement, who would say, yes, we can forgive you. We can forget. In return, we want a carte blanche support for the colonization of Palestine, for everything we do in Palestine, including the ethnic cleansing and the rejection of the right of return. And this is very important because there's even a more profound layer to this alliance between anti-Semitism in Europe and Zionism. Because both movements, anti-Semitism and Zionism, have something in common. They don't want to see the Jews in Europe. And they don't care if the price for not seeing the Jews in Europe is the displacement of the Palestinians. This is not just an historical alliance. This is a very powerful alliance that provides one of the layers for the defense shield that protects Israel from international condemnation. Two very short points with this I will end. One is, and Lubna said it, I just want to stress it again. The right of return should be seen not just a demand by the international community to allow the 1948 refugees to return to their homes. Israel continued the ethnic cleansing. In fact, today it continues the ethnic cleansing. We've seen it in May 21 when ethnic cleansing in East Jerusalem caught the attention of the world for a moment, and so on. So it's an ongoing Nakba, as Lubna said, an ongoing ethnic cleansing, and therefore the right of return is not just for the 48 Palestinians, but for every Palestinian who is a victim of the Israeli ethnic cleansing policies, which, as I say, are still perpetrated to this very day. And my very last point, and again, I think Lubna alluded to this, but I would just like to highlight it again, and with this I will end. It is very clear that anyone who genuinely deals with the Palestine issue as a problem that has to be solved for the sake of the Palestinians, for the sake of the Jews, for the sake of the Arab world, for the sake of the world as a whole. It's very clear that decolonization, which is the main process that has to take place in order for liberation, freedom, and justice to be restored to Palestine, would never be a possibility without a total acceptance of the right of return of the Palestinian refugees. There will be no decolonization without repatriation of the refugees and their families and their descendants. And this is a particularly important message since the Middle East, since 2012, is experiencing another horrific wave of refugeehood. And the fact that the one country that doesn't play any role in dealing with this refugee problem, although some of the refugees are Palestinians who have relatives inside Israel, is the state of Israel. And this, the way the world tolerates this idea that the exceptionalism that Israel enjoys, that allows it to continue its policies of oppression on the ground, is extended to the way it treats the Palestinian refugees and the Arab refugees in the Middle East, is something to convey as a message to the world and request a response for this immoral and illogical position that at the time when everybody talks about refugees and the need to find a solution for a problem of refugees. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pape. As usual, what we can expect from you, an incredible historical analysis, a longue durée perspective in which different trends and tendencies that have emerged since not just the time of the Nakba, but even before, and how that has affected the particular issue that we're dealing with today. The insights that we gain from you provide a very effective and clear sense of what strategies are actually required right now to do precisely what we have said in the title, address the issue of the practicalities and the morality and the legality of the Palestinian right of return. So thank you, Professor Pape, for that presentation. And now we will turn to our dear brother, Naeem Jinnah, as our second discussant. Naeem?
Thank you, Junaid, for passing the floor on to me and for a very generous introduction. I must just say, if Ilan Pape found Lubna's presentation a hard act to follow, have some sympathy for me, who has to follow Lubna and Ilan. There's not much that is left to say in terms of all of the various kinds of issues raised by Lubna, and then the global and geopolitical perspectives that Ilan presented to us thereafter, situating the right of return and refugeehood of Palestinians within that. The one thing that I think we must commend Palestinians, firstly, and of course the Palestinian Solidarity Movement globally for, is the fact that 7 decades later, every year we still commemorate the Nakba. And every year on the 11th of December, we still have events that talk about Resolution 194 and the right of return. Particularly in light of this quote attributed to David Ben-Gurion, which seems that it actually is not from him, but nevertheless, the quote that as far as Palestinians are concerned, the old will forget and the old will die and the young will forget. This is perhaps one of the greater battles that oppressed people have to face, keeping memory alive and making sure that memory itself becomes the weapon in the struggle for liberation. So I think that we need to make this point repeatedly every year, that the fact that we are again commemorating the Nakba and talking about the right of return means that the old, well, frankly, the old have not died and the young have not forgotten. And those that were young and have become old are ensuring that these memories persist as well. MLN's choice of a topic for this, I think, has been extremely important, and this certainly is kind of one of Badil's focuses in terms of how it deals with the right of return, and that is, as Ilan also said, going beyond simply talking about the right and talking about it in a kind of rhetorical way, but talking about how that right might actually be made a reality, preparing the ground for the time when the right of return is able to become a reality, and smoothing the way, the process for when that does happen, so that the return and the welcoming back of Palestinian refugees to their lands and to their homes might become a better process, a smoother process, a realistic process, and a process that allows refugees to actually feel like they are returning home. The other important part of focusing on the practicalities, of course, as again, both Lubna and Ilan pointed out, is that part of the kind of argument against the implementation of the right of return is this notion that it's not practical, that it's not realistic, that it can't happen. There are too many Palestinian refugees, or there are too many descendants of Palestinian refugees, or that Jewish populations are entrenched now in wherever they live for so many generations, or that the cost would be too great, or that it would cause disruptions and dislocations of Palestinians themselves and the countries in which they are being hosted, etc., etc. All of these kinds of arguments about why the right of return for Palestinian refugees, as Lubna said, the longest refugee population in the world, why it's not realistic and it's not practical. And to be able to, before even there's an agreement that the right would be implemented, to begin to lay the groundwork for talking about how it is practical, also addresses that argument, the argument that it is not practical. And so based on that argument that it's not practical and not realistic, of course, we have all of these proposals over the past few years or couple of decades about a certain percentage of refugees being allowed, only certain kinds of descendants or no descendants, whatever the case might be, because a fiction is created around the idea of the of how realistic return might be. And what Lubna is saying quite clearly, and from the work of Badil over many years, is that there has lots of work been done on this. These are the practical steps that will happen. And of course, Badil is not the only one. One of the great scholars on the issue of Palestinian refugees and the right of return, Salman Abu Sitta, has spoken about this in great detail over many years, many a time, with maps showing where people were removed from and how return might take place, etc. So that practical, realistic stuff is important work that is being done. But we shouldn't, in saying that, we should also not forget that for the Zionist argument about the right of return, raising the issue, as fictional as it might be, raising the issue of practicality and whether it is realistic, is really a kind of part of a bigger project. The opposition and the rejection by Zionists and their supporters and their apologists of the right of return is not because they hate refugees. It's not because they don't think that the right of return means anything. In fact, as Lubna pointed out, Resolution 194 is simply a reiteration of international law rights that have existed already for a long time. Israel was a signatory to the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees, served on a number of committees that came out of that convention. And of course, the vast majority of Israeli Jews are themselves, or might themselves, be regarded in some or other way as refugees. So it's not about refugees. The rejection of the right of return of Palestinian refugees is part of the bigger project of ethnic cleansing, of ensuring that Palestine becomes Palestinian free. Rejecting the right of return is just but one part of that. In a sense, and not to quote, but to express the sentiment of Benny Morris, that the job that was done by the Zionist gangs, etc., in 1947, 48, 49, and the Israeli occupation forces thereafter, that yes, they did all these things, but they just didn't do it well enough. And so you still have the problem of Bedouins in Israel. You still have the problem of 20% of the Israeli population being Palestinians, because, as Benny Morris suggests, the Zionists didn't finish the job. And that is the point, that rejecting the right of return is one cog in that wheel of finishing the job of getting rid of Palestinians and ensuring that that Palestinians don't exist in Palestine. So it's part of this bigger project, which includes the law of return from 1948. It includes, as Lubna said, the absentee property law of 1950. It includes the nation-state law more recently. All of these are part of the project of making Palestine free of Palestinians. The creation of settlements, of course, is part of that. The manner in which the military occupation of the West Bank and the siege on Gaza is imposed is part of that, to move towards the full ethnic cleansing of Palestine. What we saw taking place in Sheikh Jarrah and other neighborhoods in Jerusalem is part of that. And so the rejection of the right of return is one part of that, of ridding Palestine of Palestinians. Now, because I'm South African, I tend to view the world from South African eyes, which of course is, I suppose, a normal thing. It would be abnormal if I were to view the world from any other eyes. And so I think back to the end of apartheid in South Africa. And certainly in terms of numbers of refugees, we're not talking about the same kind of numbers by any stretch of the imagination. But nevertheless, the apartheid state in the South African context, in the Namibian context, the notion that refugees would return, that exiles would return, was just a normally accepted thing. And the reason why it was just a normally accepted thing was because by that point, there really wasn't any, well, certainly in the South African and Namibian case, there never was really the intention of making either South Africa or Namibia free of its indigenous population. And so these refugees or exiles just reuniting with the rest of the indigenous population that was already there was just a natural consequence of the negotiations that led to the end of those systems of apartheid that existed. In the Palestinian case, of course, it's a very different thing, in that there never has been an acceptance by the Zionist project that Palestinians should continue to be there, that they should continue to be in Palestine. Whether they're indigenous or not, they just should not be there. Now, having mentioned South Africa and Namibia and the issue of apartheid, I think that I just want to make a point about linking this as well. Also, because of something that Ilan said. Ilan made the point that there can be no decolonization in the Palestinian context without the right of return. I want to suggest that, in fact, there can be no proper and realistic return of Palestinian refugees without the dismantling of apartheid that Israel practices, both in the occupied Palestinian territory as well as within Israel itself. And if we think of the Apartheid Convention, Article 2, which describes what apartheid practices are, Clause B of Article 2 says the deliberate imposition on a racial group or groups of living conditions calculated to cause its or their physical destruction in whole or in part. This really didn't apply in a very literal context, in a very literal way like this in the South African context, despite the fact that when the convention was drawn up, in the minds of the drafters, they were thinking of South Africa and Namibia in particular. But it does apply very much to the Palestinian context. The intention that conditions must be created that are calculated to cause the physical destruction in whole or in part of the Palestinian population. And And of course, I would go beyond just the physical destruction of Palestinian lives and bodies, etc. What we also see as part of this ethnic cleansing, and I prefer to use the term ethnic cleansing in this regard, or genocide rather than appropriation, is the way in which there's a calculated attempt to destroy the ownership of even Palestinian culture by Palestinians. So we see this, of course, the joke among many of us, of course, is the hummus joke. That hummus, hummus has become now in many parts of the world is being called Israeli cuisine. But over the past few days, we've seen all these pictures and videos of these despicable Miss Universe contestants visiting destroyed villages in Palestine, wearing these outfits with the tertiz, with the Palestinian embroidery, which is very much part of that attempt of cultural genocide, but also in a sense to ensure that a right of return, or the return of Palestinian refugees, is the denial of the right of return of Palestinian refugees is also a denial of the return of Palestinian culture to Palestinians. So it's not just a denial of Palestinians to return to their land, but a denial of what belongs to Palestinians to be returned to them. And I think that these then different projects for us, firstly, that as Ilan pointed out, the right of return is perhaps the Palestinian right which is least talked about by the Palestinian solidarity movement globally, compared to various other rights. And I think that this needs to change, because in my opinion, it's one of the most fundamental of rights of Palestinians. So that's the first project that I think that we need much more discussion about in the Palestinian solidarity movement globally. The second one is the project that Ilan spoke about, which is decolonization and what that means. And perhaps we should have a seminar on the practicalities of decolonization. And the third one is the anti-apartheid struggle as regards Israel and as regards the Palestinian struggle. So I want to leave it there, and thank you to both Lubna and Ilan for making my task much more challenging than it could have been. Thank you.
Thank you, Naeem. I just thought that I'm sure there are plenty of webinars taking place today, as they should be on this important day, but the quality of the discussion that we've had so far, as well as the individuals involved, not only through their intellectual input, but through their commitments, lifelong commitments, I'm not sure if any of those can compete with ours today. So I'm very happy and proud, and I hope the participants are enjoying it as much as I am. But thank you, Naeem. I think that you situate this very particular question of the right of return within the larger issue and the larger project of the ethnic cleansing of Zionist settler colonialism, and that it should be seen within that larger project and not separated from it, because it is precisely as you alluded to, that not only does Israel, not allow for the right of return or recognize these refugees, it doesn't even recognize the so-called non-refugee Palestinians that exist there and would wish for them to go away as well. So this is a project, as you suggest at the end, there's no decolonization without first dismantling what the Zionist apartheid state itself is. It is, which is not to say that the specific struggle for the right of return is not important. It is to suggest that the wider vision of how to struggle and confront Zionism always needs to also be taken into consideration. So thank you for that, Naeem. And I know that we have some questions, some comments that we should get to, because I actually have quite a few this time, more than usual. So let me try to start with the easiest. I know our good friend Steve has has a question. It's a bit detailed, so let me get back to that, Steve. I hope you don't mind. The one of the questions is interesting because I think it's, I mean, we didn't name our good friend, but who just turned 93 on December 7th. And I'm, of course, referring to Professor Noam Chomsky. But one of the questions refers to Chomsky and says, why is Chomsky, this is our friend Imad from Istanbul, why is Chomsky opposed to the right of return, though he rightly recognizes the injustices to the Palestinians? And I think it's important that, you know, Chomsky is, because of the respect that he has within the global Palestine solidarity movement, general social justice communities. This has been very controversial, his position. Of course, he's taken, I think, he's correctly been criticized for it. But if any of you have any comments on, besides just criticizing him, but why Chomsky has come to this type of conclusion? Is it the same logic of, well, it's not practical right now, which of, you know, I mean, I'm sorry to keep going on, but of course, you know, a lot of things seemed impractical. You know, getting rid of slavery seemed impractical. Getting rid of apartheid in South Africa seemed impractical. Anyways, that's me kind of responding. But if any of you would like to respond.
Well, one of the reasons I wrote 2 books with him was that we had arguments on 3 points. One, different approach to the right of return. This came particularly in our joint book on Palestine. The second, our approach to BDS, where we differ. He's much more reserved in his support for BDS. And lastly, he doesn't support the one-state solution, which I do. So I think if you want to understand, then this is for Imad. And I think Imad is right. I mean, this is something we should ask ourselves. By the way, Norman Finkelstein, who is also devoted his life to support the Palestinian struggle and even lost his job because of that, subscribes to similar position on it. So I think it goes together, by the way, the support for the one state, for BDS, and the right of return. They're inseparable. Why do people who really, not only, as I say, devoted their life for supporting the Palestinians and paid highly for that support, are subscribing to views that we find unacceptable today, is something, of course, that cannot always be answered completely. We don't have a pass into people's psyche and ideas. I think that in the end of the day, a lot of American Jews, and both of these people we mentioned are American Jews, who are even very progressive when it comes on Palestine, still have this, what shall I call it, Zionist germ in them, in the sense that they do, maybe even unconsciously, expect to be living in a world where there is an alternative should what happened in Europe happen to Jews in America. And that, I think, brings to the fore, to my mind, an unreasonable position on all these 3 issues that I mentioned. I say unreasonable because if you examine their position on other cases in the world to which they have contributed immensely in struggling against injustice, it would not stand the examination of morality or even logic when it comes to any other place. So yes, Zionism is a great project of fabrication, of fear, intimidation. It complicates the life, especially of Jews, and especially of American Jews. Not everyone can liberate themselves from everything. I don't think there is a point of trying to change someone's point of view at the age of 93. And we should be happy with the fact that he has devoted his life in so many ways to support the Palestinian cause. Yeah, these, and you know, debates within the solidarity movement are not something bad. They are legitimate. And I think this is the best one can say about it. I would not, as someone suggested 2 years ago, write a whole book condemning Chomsky for his positions. I think that would be wrong. Our energies are needed elsewhere, really. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
That's very well put. Thank you, Professor Pape. Steve, I'll get to you. And in fact, I'm wondering if Steve can maybe verbally express his questions, because I think they're very good, but I think he may be able to explain them better than I probably would. There are 2-3 questions, and I think they relate to what Naeem was speaking about earlier, the clear differences between a repatriation model that existed in the contexts of Namibia or post-apartheid South Africa and Israel. But the question, and this is from my student Faraz in the United States from Pakistan right now, are there any historical precedents, successful or unsuccessful, of such a repatriation project? So I don't know, Naeem, if you want to reiterate what you said earlier.
The 2 examples that I used, the scale of repatriation is completely different. To be honest, I just used those 2 examples so I could segue into my discussion about apartheid. But I think that Lubna probably is able to answer that question better, because this is the kind of stuff that Badil does do.
Sure, absolutely. Lubna?
Of course, thanks, Naeem. Badil has studied 3 instances, let's say, of the application of the right to repatriation, including in a situation in which forcible transfer or forced displacement occurred, and there was a situation that was created vast numbers of refugees or IDPs. One of them was South Africa, one of them was Cyprus, and the other one was former Yugoslavia. And we have taken and looked at the intricacies or the nuances that were applied in each of those instances of repatriation, and looked at what made the repatriation succeed or fail. And success, of course, is there's different levels, and without actually getting into, I mean, it's a fairly intensive situation, intensive process. I will second what Naeem said. In the situation of South Africa, where we're looking at a situation of vast numbers of IDPs, internally displaced persons, rather than refugees, people coming from outside the area in question. In the terms of former Yugoslavia, we were talking about approximately 1 million refugees who actually were repatriated, but the mechanisms to establish economic and social stability weren't followed through upon significantly enough so that the repatriation could last. In the case of Cyprus, it was managed by the UN, and it was probably one of the poorest cases of the implementation of the right of repatriation and return. So while the historic examples weren't as successful as they could have been, it does provide a situation in which we can study them and learn from the failures and successes of those various examples in order to make the reparation of Palestinian refugees that much more successful. It is my understanding in the case of former apartheid South Africa, the focus in the Daytona Peace Agreement was on the individual rights and establishing the individual ownership of the properties, rather than providing mechanisms for the correct management and use of those properties. So even though there has been reparation for South African IDPs, they did not have the capacities and the resources to be able to maintain those properties, and they actually ended up, the vast majority of them being, not to mention that the process is extremely slow, but also they also ended up being sold to white landowners. And the actual apartheid situation in South Africa, if I may say, is even though the legislation was revised, the situation still remains a very unequal distribution of power and authority within that state. So yes and no, I guess, is the simple answer. But yes, there are certain elements that are the best practices of states. There are certain elements that we can use to guide the return of Palestinian refugees and internally displaced persons, so that we can make it as sustainable and create a situation that is actually better than the situation that existed in 1948. If I may go back to the question about Chomsky and his rejection of the right of return. When we talk about a situation in which we have a colonial apartheid regime, or even a colonial apartheid, a colonial mentality, we are talking about groups who are experiencing privilege, because you have to have a superior group and you have to have an inferior group. The superior group oppressing the supposed inferior group. And this creates a regime that is designed to provide not rights, but privilege to those who are experiencing the other side of that regime. The oppressor experiences privilege. And this is part of the reason why I think that even though maybe subconsciously people recognize the injustice in Palestine, and Chomsky perhaps recognizes the human rights violations and crimes, and the elemental wrongness of the denial of the right of return and the creation of Israel on Palestine. He also recognizes his, and I'm not just saying him, I'm saying in general, but I still think it's a valid reason. Not it's a valid reason, but explaining his resistance to the right of return is because there will be a loss of privilege. But the loss of privilege does not mean the loss of rights. The loss of privilege just means the loss of privilege, and that equity and equal rights are distributed the way they are supposed to be distributed to everyone, regardless of their race, ethnicity, nationality, sex, gender, et cetera, color of skin, yada, yada, yada. So that this is, I think, probably one of the hardest hurdles, or something that we really need to address, particularly when we're talking about the right of return. We have to create a return situation or a reparations situation that is actually better than the situation that we are in. And so that it becomes a situation to which people strive to achieve, where rights are respected, regardless of whether you are a returnee or you're a secondary occupant. And this requires the acknowledgement of the colonial complicity of Israeli civil society, Israeli colonizers. There must be a recognition among Israelis that they are colonizers, and they must recognize this in themselves and be able to say that, no, I'm not going to be a colonizer anymore. I'm going to be an individual who respects the rights of others, particularly Palestinians, because I have wronged them either directly or indirectly. And when I renounce my colonization status, I will be able to live in peace and dignity with my Palestinian neighbor.
Very well put, Lubna. Thank you so much for that, and for Professor Pape as well for answering this question, which I know that has dogged the Palestine solidarity movement for quite a while, that we recognize Chomsky's contributions, but on certain things, on this BDS and the right of return, we kind of don't know what's happened to him. But we wish him happy birthday a few days ago, and may he continue to share thoughts on global justice that are very valuable. I want to move on. We have just a little bit of time left, so I'm going to try to combine a few of these last questions. I don't want to be accused of ignoring a question which may not be along the lines that we most of us tend to believe, but maybe I'm just confusing the question. So there's a question from I think Yusuf, and the question is: after the close to a century of denial, Germany has officially acknowledged committing genocide during its colonial occupation of Namibia and announced financial aid worth more than 1.1 billion euro. This sets a dangerous precedent for others seeking restitution and reparation, which needs to be countered. Well, maybe this is more a comment than an opinion, but yeah, if anyone wants to say anything, or we can just respect such an opinion or not respect it. Anyone have any comments or anything like that? No? Okay, we can move on.
I mean,
sorry, please, Luna.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with that situation at all, but I would like to say that in any situation in which a human rights violation or crime is committed, there is the right to repatriation. I mean, while we are supposed to, or the international community, particularly the UN and other global bodies, let's say, are supposed to put forth their best efforts to prevent such human rights violations and crimes from occurring. If they occur, then there is the right to reparations, and that should be upheld. That should be upheld whether we are talking about people from Namibia, or we're talking about Tibet, or we're talking about Western Sahara, or we're talking about World War II and the Holocaust, or if we're talking about Palestinians. I mean, this is the whole point of international law. It sets the measuring stick, or the ways in which we are supposed to deal with international crimes and human rights violations. And we are supposed to apply that in equal measure, regardless of which group of people we are talking about. So I don't understand, like I said, I don't understand why Yusuf made that comment, but if there was a situation in which human rights violations occurred and people were displaced, dispossessed, then they do have a right to repatriation, whether it was 100 years ago or 20 years ago or today. So I don't think that there should be a time frame or a time limit on that. And I say that without knowing exactly what that particular situation is.
Absolutely, and he was speaking about reparations and so on. And of course, this is a global issue. I mean, we in the context of the United States, with the history of African Americans, of Indigenous people, Native Americans, First Nations in Canada, etc. All of these are issues that are being recognized now. Whether the balance of forces exist where we can politically convince the revanchist right-wing forces to do the right thing and actually do this is another question. But there's an acknowledgement that, of course, for all of these historical crimes, which most people acknowledge, there needs to be some remedial implementation in the form of reparations and so on and so forth. Now, the final two things I'll get to. One involves some of my students in Pakistan who are asking about the Palestine Solidarity Movement they're involved in, and at one point, some of you know, because I had invited particularly, I think, Naeem and Professor Pape to speak to this question of the intense pressure of normalizing relations with Israel. That was particularly being placed on Pakistan as this key Muslim country that would get on board. Now, thankfully, Pakistan successfully resisted that at that point. The questions basically are, to what extent does that pressure continue to exist at the present, around the peace deals with the UAE and so on. So if anyone wants to comment on that, has the momentum thrust about from that? Was that a particular Trump era phenomena that the Israelis could kind of really capitalize on, or is that ongoing? So anyone would want to address that?
Yeah, if I can.
Sure.
First of all, no, it's not just a Trump era event. And we should remember that before the so-called Abraham Accord, Egypt and Jordan normalized its relations with Israel. We keep forgetting that because we're focusing now on the UAE
Yes.
Bahrain and Morocco. No, it's more disturbing maybe if you look, for instance, at the Israeli involvement in the Sudan, where the Americans asked the Israelis to mediate, if you would believe that, between the military and the political parties, because Israel has good military relations with the army and has economic power that affects the political side in that case. Naim probably can talk about it more than I do, but the Israeli involvement in the regional policies in Africa is ongoing. It's the only thing I can say about it, and this is important to remember, from the very beginning, there was a difference between the lobbying of Zionism, or the way the Zionist movement lobbied, and later the State of Israel, and the way the Palestinian National Liberation Movement lobbied, for good or for worse. But there's a distinct telling difference. The Zionist lobby cared very little about civil societies and basic public opinions. From the very beginning, it looked for the power that be. Governments, economic infrastructure. If you look at the budgets of the Zionist lobbying and then the Israeli lobbying, you will see very little is invested in the society itself. All the resources are going to the political elite, military elite, economic elite. The Palestinian lobbying, if there was such a thing, was more of an advocacy actually, is always about the community, a church, a school, a university, very little contact with political elites and so on, which is commendable, but of course less effective in many ways. And I think we're still there today, although at least one should say the approach to the civil society begins to reap some dividends, one should say. Unfortunately, only 72 years later, we have a global civil society which is pro-Palestinians, which definitely doesn't have a base for pro-Israeli attitudes. And it is in a direct clash with the political and economic elites of the world, who are almost all of them, with few exceptions, support the State of Israel. Now, the clash between what civil society regards as a moral policy, by the way, domestically or foreign policy, and what political and economic elites regard as moral policy, the gap has widened in the 21st century. And therefore, it's very clear that a successful Palestinian struggle has to be connected, not just to Palestine, but to all these struggles where the political and economic elites totally disregard what most of the members of society regard as moral issues. We have this gap, especially in the West, but not only in the West. And I think, therefore, the normalization effort will continue. I don't think we have seen the last of the Arab regimes joining Israel. I don't think so. I think we'll see another 3 or 4 states in the near future normalizing relations with Israel. I will see Israel deepening its contact in China, in India, and who knows, maybe they will try again in Pakistan and Indonesia and Malaysia, where they have some successes. So we have to ask ourselves, how do we make sure that the very positive developments in the civil society would continue to be enhanced and eventually influence the policies from above. Junaid, we can't hear you. You
Sorry.
have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sorry. Naim, did you want to add to that?
That's Junaid, but I see that there are 3 questions that really are related to what I said. So at some point, if I could answer those, I'd be happy.
Sure. So just before that, let me just recognize, I mean, because this normalization thing, actually, all 3 of the students are here, Aqib, Faraz, and Ramis, who have been very much interested, and Professor Pape during that period some of these students were very instrumental actually in constant mobilization against that normalization pressure. So thanks for coming out and come to our other webinars as well. I also want to recognize Imad from SIGA in Turkey. So all of you, thank you for coming out, and please come out to all the rest of our webinars as well. Naeem, you said that there are some questions that you see. Might one of Steve's questions be included in the ones you want to address?
Yes, so it's John Minto, Maren Behrend, and Steve's second question.
Okay, brilliant. Please.
Okay, so John Minto asks, what similarities do I see between Jewish Israelis and white South Africans regarding the two anti-apartheid struggles? Will Jewish Israelis flip over to majority support for the end of apartheid in the way white South Africans did once the pressure became irresistible? I think at the present conjuncture, there are a number of differences between white South Africans and Jewish Israelis in the main. So in the South African context, some of these factors include, for example, that by the 80s, there was a substantial, not by any stretch of the imagination, majority or anything like that, but substantial opposition that had grown within the white community to apartheid. And that included a number of organizations. You had the End Conscription campaign. You had, of course, a number of the members of the leaders of the Communist Party were whites, many of them Jews as well, etc. So that's the one factor, the kind of opposition that had grown within the white community. A second one is that particularly with regards to white Afrikaners, perhaps less so by English-speaking whites, but particularly white Afrikaners, that there was a very strong sense of South Africa being their homeland, and not having any allegiance or any association with any other country, which meant that very few white Afrikaners had dual citizenship. Many English-speaking whites had dual citizenship with Britain, for example, but not Afrikaners, which meant that they imagined the long-term future for their children, grandchildren, and other descendants being in South Africa, and they needed to make it work. And then, of course, the third part of that was that by that point in 1980s, there was a strong sanctions, as we call it, sanctions campaign against apartheid South Africa, so that by the late 80s, the fiscus was able to guarantee its budget for about 3 weeks at a time. I mean, I don't want to overemphasize the role of international solidarity, but it certainly had a very important role. I think that that's why we have BDS, of course, in the Palestinian context, and that will get us there. But I don't think that we're going to see in the near future any kind of flip. I mean, we didn't see it in South Africa either. It wasn't a sudden flip. It was a grudging acceptance. So we're not going to see a sudden flip of Jewish Israelis to accept that. The question that, in a sense, kind of follows up on that is Maren's question. In saying for the right of return to eventuate that the apartheid system needs to be dismantled, aren't you really saying that the state of Israel founded on religious and ethnic identity must be dismantled and re-emerge as a secular state? Maren, absolutely, you understood me correctly. Yes, the state of Israel founded as an ethnocratic state, continuing as an ethnocratic state, using religion to bolster that ethnocratic state. That ethnocracy has to be dismantled. There's nothing wrong with saying that. In South Africa, we said that apartheid had to be dismantled. So apartheid has to be dismantled in the Israeli context too. And the question continues, how do you get people to renounce colonization when it means renouncing the religious conviction of exclusive God-given rights to a promised land? You have to beat sense into them. I'm sorry to say this, but yes. And beating sense into them means strengthening the BDS campaign, supporting, strengthening the support for Palestinian resistance in all forms against Israeli apartheid and colonization. People who are in the kind of privileged position that Jewish Israelis are, that whites were in the South African context, don't suddenly one morning wake up and decide that that they are going to renounce that privilege. They have to be taught that that is the case, and often it has to be beaten into them through, like in the South African context, through the sanctions campaign, through making their lives difficult, through ensuring that they could not play sports on the global field, to ensure that they could not have musicians come to South Africa, etc. That's what needs to be done. We must not be gentle about how we deal with oppression. Those who are privileged need to have sense beaten into them. And finally, Steve Little's comment, do you think Virginia Tilley's recasting of identity solution would uncouple the great fear of Israelis of demographic destruction? Her recasting, he says, is that Jewish should equal not a people with superior rights to the land or even nation with rights to self-determination, but, quote, an ethnic group with full civil, social, and cultural rights. And Palestinian equals not a racial ethnic identity assigned by Zionism and imposed by apartheid, but a multi-sectarian identity embraced by everyone in the territory. Assuming that Steve is correctly characterizing what Virginia Tilley said, I have a problem with this. The problem is that the way this characterizes it is that Palestinian is this identity that includes everyone, but then there's within that a specific Jewish identity, and those who have that Jewish identity should get particular ethnic, particular civil, social, and cultural rights as a group. I mean, this kind of flips the notion of justice for me, because the notion of justice should imply that those who had been oppressed in the past, that there needs to be restitution to them, that they should be, if at all, I mean, I would prefer not to have group rights, but if there were to be group rights, then it should be those who were oppressed, who were exploited, who were dispossessed, who were colonized, that group rights should apply firstly to them in order to level the playing fields, in order to restore to them the dignity that was they were robbed of, the land they were robbed of, the wealth they were robbed of, etc. If you want to go this route of kind of group rights, and I'm not one that is not someone that's convinced by that, then you should talk about a broad Palestinian identity as it's characterized there, but within that, two sets of group rights. Jewish group rights, because as the argument goes, they have a fear for their security, etc. And then a separate kind of Palestinian group rights for those who are, let's say, ethnically Palestinian, a kind of broad affirmative action policy that will ensure restitution, etc. You can't have the first without having the second. That just sounds ridiculous, turning the whole process on its head, and in fact finding a way of continuing apartheid under a different name. And so let me end on this, that I think Steve, Salim Valley and I have a chapter in a book called Pretending Democracy, Israel and Ethnocratic State, where we talk about what a one state will look like in terms of these kinds of issues, in terms of Jewish, Palestinian, etc. And perhaps that's a chapter that I would suggest that you read. I'll put the link for it in the chat. Thank you.
If I could piggyback on that answer.
Absolutely.
I'd just like to say that according to international law, and this is as early as the Lausanne Agreement during the occupation of the Ottomans and Turkey in, I can't remember the exact year, but prior to 1917 or 1922, I believe. The Palestinian people were recognized as a national people with a national territory that is mandatory Palestine. So we are not talking about a group. We are talking about a people with a national identity. They are Palestinians. Unfortunately, they have been dispersed to all areas of the world because of the mandates, because of the Nakba, because of the occupation of 1967, because of the ongoing Nakba and denial of return. but they are a national people with the right to national self-determination on the territory of mandatory Palestine. Israel and those Jewish Israelis residing, colonizing mandatory Palestine have no such recognition. No such recognition under international law. They are not a people. They are not recognized as a people. They are a group of people who have a shared religious identity. And I say that quite loosely because Zionism itself is secular, but that's a whole nother discussion in and of itself. People, regardless of their religious denomination, should enjoy the full spectrum of human rights, regardless of where they reside, period. But Palestinians are not a group. They are a national people with the right of self-determination over mandatory Palestine as their state. And so the conflagration of Judaism, or the hijacking of Judaism to fit the colonial apartheid Zionist movement, is just that. It's the hijacking of that religion in order to feed the political colonial apartheid regime that is Israel. And I'll stop there.
Thanks, Lubna. Thanks, Naeem. Very moving and incisive way to end this. And I think that I probably will be losing my credentials as an effective moderator after today. This is the hazard of having me or any academic. I can just enjoy listening to you all forever, and then forget that this is a webinar where others are also listening. So I apologize to the participants for going a little bit over time. I also apologize. There are some very interesting comments and some questions that we will some of the questions we will hope to kind of answer, and you can get in touch personally. But thank you all for the participation. In terms of our speakers, I think there's definitely a consensus, incredibly inspirational. Their immense intellect and eloquence, probably second only to the moral courage they've displayed year after year in their commitment to global justice generally, and to the Palestinian struggle for dignity, justice, and liberation specifically. So at this point, I want to thank all of the speakers for being in the webinar today. I want to thank all of our participants for being here. And I think that this was certainly one of our better, most informative, and hopefully one that inspires all of us in all of the different countries we're in to continue the struggle, not only on the right of return, but the general struggle, as Naeem said, to dismantle apartheid in Zionist Israel. So with that, thank you very much. And I will turn it over to Hassanal, if he's still around.
Yes, thanks, Junaid.
Sure.
So for everyone else as well, I can say thank you for attending today to our webinar. So if anyone still has any comments or any other feedback they would like to give, I've placed our Gmail account for the MLN Gmail account in the chat below. So feel free to get in touch with us. And who knows, maybe one of your comments might actually inform the theme of our future webinars and our roundtable discussions as well. This roundtable itself will definitely be uploaded to our respective YouTube accounts. And if anyone wants to check it out there, feel free to share in the information with your friends. And together, let's continue this struggle to bring voice to the cause of the Palestinian struggle and the issue of apartheid and Zionism in Israel and the world over. So thank you everyone for coming. So to all the speakers as well, thank you all for attending. And we'll see you in our next event, everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Janet, for hosting as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Hassanal.
Bye.
Of course. Bye-bye.